Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first Fact Alliance MIT J-WAFS BOKU seminar series. I'm Greg Sixt from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Jameel Water and Food Systems Lab, where I lead the Fact Alliance, a global research network of over 20 institutions focused on integrative research to address food systems challenges in a changing climate. With me today is my colleague, Professor Michael Hauser. We are co-teaching a class on environmental security at BOKU University in Vienna. And today's panel will focus on the title of today's talk is From Mines to Meadows, Regreening Post-War Landscapes. And it's going to be a very, very interesting topic. So I'm going to hand it off to Michael for the rest of the introductions. Michael, off to you.
Thank you, Greg, and warm welcome to all of you. Well, the topic is a difficult one because landmines and explosive remnants of war are really long-term legacies of conflict, and they're cruel at every level. In 2023, almost 6,000 casualties were reported. That's according to the Landmine Monitor. 85% of those casualties were actually civilians, and half were children. So landmines and explosive remnants of war, they kill, and long after the conflict actually ended, they destroy farmland, contaminate grazing areas, leave lasting trauma in communities and people. And yet we are asking this pertinent question: can landmine affected ecosystems, can landmine affected areas, landscapes be restored? And we're very happy to have a distinguished panel with us, which I would like to introduce. Emily Chrystie from Harlow Trust UK, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, demining foundation in the UK. Emily works directly in minefields and clearance operations. With us is Elina Zakharchenko from Sumy National Agrarian University, Eastern Ukraine, a soil scientist. She's been working on restoring contaminated soils after land manufacturing and contamination. And then we have Anja Gassner with us from World Agroforestry, in short CIFOR-ICRAF, from the German Directorate. ICRAF and Anja have been working on restoration by default and definition. And we have with us Elisabeth Lapierre, our student assistant, who will monitor the comments, take your questions, and she will return. Elizabeth, you would return into the conversation about 30 minutes from now. So please use the chat function to post your comments, questions, and the like. So thanks, Elizabeth. See you in a minute. Now, I mean, if you look at international treaties and policies, then the situation should be pretty clear. The Ottawa Convention from 1997 that was endorsed a little bit later actually banned mines, created a norm against landmines in a fairly strong manner. The Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the CCW 1980, did that already before 2008. The Convention on Cluster Munitions, CCM, came into place, and quite a number of countries undersigned those treaties. Yet we have an enormous challenge with mines, as I said at the beginning, and they create an enormous suffering in people, as well as destroy landscapes. And the demining itself isn't anything but ecological. Now, especially when you use heavy machinery to do so. Now, I would like to understand from the panel first. How can I understand a minefield? How does a landscape that comes with mines look like? Elina, you're working in Eastern Ukraine. You probably step out of your house and you're affected by landmines in one way or the other. Please help us to understand what's happening.
Mhm. Okay, dear participants, so I hope everybody can see me, yeah?
Yes.
The video, okay. So yeah, I live in the territory near Russian border, only 30 kilometers from them. So it's region now on safety, of course, but we still working at our university. I'm from Sumy National Agrarian University. Our students are agronomists and forestry students also. And for last 3 years, we took soil samples from different regions, from Kherson Oblast region, Kharkiv, Chernigiv, Kiev, Sumy region, and in some cases it was dangerous, I think. For example, you have, of course, of administration, could we go to take soil samples in the occupied area or near battle line? It's the first that we should do, because agronomists and tractor drivers sometimes are heroes. They work in unsafety places. For example, in July 2025, agronomists from the Konotop district, it's our Sumy region, took us to the place where the occupants' equipment burned in 2022. So 3 years, yeah. So Russian soldiers were stationed there for some days, and this location is officially marked on public websites. And we decided to come in this fall, and since sunflowers were growing there and it was inconvenient for us to take soil samples, we arrived last Friday, and we were surprised that Hala Trust and the mining were working in the same location, you see? So we were there in the July, and now only Hala Trust was observed this territory, this forest belt. So that is 22, 25. Think about it. So what is interesting is that the locals cut the metal from tanks and armored vehicles in the same forest tribes. this this very very strange, very brave people. So that is why the question arose: should we select a dangerous area? Not, of course. Only the military administration can say for sure whether the inspection was complete. The situation was the same on the deoccupied territory in Chernigiv lands. The agronomists accompanied us to the fields where the land had been damaged by artillery fire, and we didn't recommend entering the forest belt by them. And it was 2023, 23rd year.
Mm.
So in Ukraine, many areas are still waiting for demining. And
Yeah.
that is not a quick process. Sappers or demining machine must cover the entire area, which may contain dangerous ammunition. It is more difficult to survey in forest belts. Here, you only need to work manually. If farmers have more money, uh, they can hire sappers from a paid company for demining territory. But most of them have to wait for suppers for free. So of course it's dangerous to walking around the military territory. It's 5-10 kilometers near battle line, and locals still live there. So FPV drones can fall down some explosive materials, of course. And even in my city, locals find out some explosives materials near unpredictable places and
Right, Elina,
be
let,
damaged. Mhm.
let me come in here. What a few sentences on how can we imagine farming and life in rural areas that depends
Mhm.
on land.
Mhm.
How do farmers manage the risk?
Okay. Local agronomists usually communicate with military, and often they make a decision together whether it's possible to remove metal residues from the soil themselves without sappers to continue agricultural work. We saw a pile of metal in the forest belt in the Kharkov region. When I asked if we could walk through the forest belt, they said that it would be better not to, as sappers will come later and they don't know when. But usually, after demining, if the territory has a lot of craters, and agronomist farmers hadn't time to cover to fill the um, to fill the soil.
Mm,
These crater with depths about 3 meters or 5 meters, so they treat the soil around these craters, so they
right,
continue to cultivate, to till the
right,
soil.
yeah. Right. Thanks a lot, Elena. Greg, and then
Just a
we move to
just
Emily.
a quick just a quick comment on terminology. So I'm not sure everyone in the audience knows what sappers are. So if we could just define what sappers are, Elina, you were mentioning sappers.
Yeah.
Sappers are deminers, right? People who
Yeah,
demine.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just want to be sure.
Right. Yeah.
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 Right. But before we go to demining, let's stay for another moment on landscapes affected by landmines. Emily, Halo was mentioned. You work in the Ukraine. Your foundation works all over the world. How can we imagine landscapes affected by mines?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael, and it's a difficult one to sum up because of the huge range of different contexts that we work in that are mined, over 30 countries at the moment that we're working in, and as you mentioned, many more that have contamination. I think Elina really touched on the point that maybe surprises most people who aren't familiar with the context, which is the sheer proximity of human populations to these areas. So a minefield, it might look like a rainforest, a desert, an agricultural field. The threat itself might be largely invisible. There might be some evidence that can be seen by the eye, like land abandonment or craters or kind of physical damage, but largely it would be an invisible threat. But the proximity of people, I think it's the vast majority of minefields that I've worked on. You will see people either attempting to use the land, use the fringes of the land. In many cases, especially minefields dating back from legacy conflicts, thinking Zimbabwe, Cambodia, you'll find local people have found pathways through the minefield over years and at great risk. And maybe local children walk to school through minefields that are very poorly marked and at great risk as well. So that proximity of people is I think really key to understand, and also I think what surprises people is how kind of risk taking activities will happen in these areas, often out of pure desperation. So in Afghanistan, for example, it's quite common to see children going into minefields to collect scrap metal because they can sell it for some value. So they're very the kind of image of a marked and abandoned area with no human contact is rarely true. I would say these are areas that are often kind of home to some of the most economically vulnerable people in a given context.
Right. And what does that do to people who live there and emotionally? I'm trying to fathom what how people manage the fear and uncertainty while pursuing livelihoods. Right?
Yes, I mean you drew on it yourself. You mentioned 80% of casualties from landmines are civilian casualties, and those statistics go back to the 1990s. So we're not talking about a given year; we're talking about a large data set. So there are accidents. There is a fear of using the land. People fear for their children, who will go out and sometimes they'll go and they'll want to play with things that they don't recognise because it looks like a toy. So a large part of our work is what we call explosive ordnance risk education. So we have teams who go around and will deliver sessions in schools and community centres and explain these threats and try to mitigate that before it happens. But I think the other thing to kind of bear in mind is that those populations who are impacted, they've often already gone through a terrible period of conflict, of war. So it's not just the impact of then their land remaining unsafe, it's also that constant reminder of a conflict which, even after the conflict has ended, it in a way it hasn't for those people who are impacted.
Right. Elina, I see you're nodding. Do you want to compliment Emily at this point?
Yeah, it's always fear because locals don't know about suddenly falling down explosive materials, And what I see, farmers and agronomists, tractor drivers are desperate people. They need work. They need to feed people. That's why they work on such lands. This
Right.
explanation.
Right. Well, I want to bring in another variable that that is critical and that we've been struggling with in our work and Anja Gassner at the World Agroforestry, and that is changing weather patterns and generally climate change, but more practically, more rains or less rains, floods in some instances. And I'm wondering how these changing weather patterns affect land mines being buried in the soil and everything else you find as consequences of war. Anyone who can help us here understand the linkage?
Yes, you're right. So depending on soil type and also compositions of soils, the dispersal radius of explosive residues and environmental conditions in the context of global warming, of course, such as high humidity in some cases, and the dry land in other cases, and also rising wind speed. So the area of primary contamination can vary greatly. This variability influences the subsequent migration dynamic of toxic elements. So we look through the soil samples in the time. So now we have soil samples from 2023, and we return to the same place, and after remediation technical stage, only soil covered by another soil non-damaged. So we will analyze such plots in our Chernozem soils and area, and also podzolized soils area. So of course the leaching of toxic elements will be the main point for our soils, especially for the northern part in Ukraine with sandy soils.
Right. Anja, I mean, what we are hearing here is then another layer of complexity of an already complex challenge, restoring degraded ecosystems, right? Um, what are your thoughts on what you've heard so far? Seeing that from an ecosystem restoration point of view and kind of bridging into the next part of the conversation. That's the restoration part. But I see also Greg unmuted.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I would like to clarify for the audience. So we as an organization, we are technical experts on developing nature-based solutions with trees, mainly agroforestry systems for various restoration needs. Our experience is not directly in mined areas. We don't have that. We do work in engagement landscapes of refugees all over Africa. So we come in, say we would come in when the mines would not explode anymore. When either that, so you don't have actually the danger of explosion anymore, but we have experienced, or I think there's also a lot of experience of using trees and plants in succession. From what I'm hearing is like when you remove the mines, it's very similar probably to having very highly compacted soil, like what you would have in mining areas of coal or minerals. That there we also have a complete dead soil, which is very highly compacted, and you basically, it looks to an outside eye, it looks normal. It looks like a land, and you might have some grass going, but underneath it's dead. You have knocked out the entire biodiversity, soil biodiversity, which is responsible for having an ecological functioning of that soil. And I think you have two parts, and I also heard Elina what you were saying. I mean, in the end, once you have moved the immediate danger, which I think is a complete different context, and you dealt with the residuals of the explosive, then it becomes a biochemical question, and how do you deal with toxicity? I think trees do have a great role to play in there, simply because trees, if you get them to grow and they're not killed by the toxicity levels in the soil, because they're very strong and big organism, their roots will be able to penetrate the soil. They generate biomass, and with the biomass you generate back soil biological processes, which is very important, because only when you have bioorganisms you can actually get back to nutrient flows, breaking down the toxins. So just sharing some thoughts here. And I guess you have a lot of literature on, or a lot of experience on old mine areas, like all over Europe. That is all there. I guess there's a lot one can learn from there. How do I restore to an ecological functioning? But the word that I really would like to use here is, for people that are not familiar with restoration, it is not simply about having a pretty landscape back that has some trees. It is really about figuring out, is that landscape, will it actually be able to function again? So I guess in the situation we just talked about, when you have conflict areas, will this land be needed again for food production? Again, a different question, because you have toxicity and residues in the soil. When will it be safe again to actually plant crops that people can eat? And the other part is like, can we bring it back to that people can be living in it? You might not necessarily be able to produce food crops in it, but you can utilize it again as people living in this area. So these are two very different restoration questions, and they go in stages. But maybe passing on to Greg.
Yeah, you set me up quite well for this question for the panel. So and that wasn't even planned. What is the legacy for the toxicity in the soils on this? I remember, I think it was the COP in Glasgow or in Sharm el Sheikh, where Ukraine's pavilion had soil samples of soils that had been, explosion that happened on. Anja, you mentioned the toxicity in the soils and the impact to crops. How long does this legacy last? what's the long-term impact to food production, and even after the explosives have been cleared away? That's for anyone to answer.
I see Elina nodding head. She's the soil science expert working in the areas. I guess she has the answer for that.
Okay, I can share. Yes, we try to compare our results from soil samples with different classification and ICO also in the European countries, and our days still Ukrainian. So we have such documents like a determination of maximum permissible concentration in Ukraine according to national standards. So we look through these documents, and we have gross amount of chemical elements as MPC, so maximum permissible concentration, and also active form. For example, usually in our scientific organizations, soil samples are taken by active by acid form, so by active form, mobile form of toxic elements. It's usually 8 chemical elements. For example, we have PICRF, so we can check much more chemical elements, but in gross amount. So in Ukraine, not so many information about maximum permissible concentration. For example, iron or cobalt or copper or nickel when we are talking about gross amount. So we need to make much more sampling and measurement, the medium concentration, so gross amount in Ukrainian soil. So it's huge part of our work for now. But when we compare our soil samples with our normative documents, we can say from 3,000 soil samples, so only barium and arsenic exceeded the Ukrainian MPC. So not so toxic chemical elements were found in high concentration, higher than in this document, like a maximum permissible concentration. But some samples we took with us in France in INRAE laboratory, and the samples were from the territory when ballistic rockets explode there, and this was like a dead area. So we checked these soils with a germination test and also with marine bacteria. So zero activity where the ballistic rocket exploded. Only then in this territory.
Right. Anja, thanks, Elina, for being very illustrative here. Yeah, Anja.
Yeah, just to follow up on Elina, for like Greg, as you asked, for maybe the people that are listening, is like, if you have in that one, we have from a lot of like sites which have toxic residues, and it's the same. If it's very, very toxic, you have to find a way of bringing the toxicities out, the toxins. One way is, like, usually you would do this with fast-growing species like grasses. You just keep on harvesting them, and then they have to export it, and you have to bring it out of sight and burn it in controlled burn sites. And it's just, I mean, both Elina and Emily, you just really described the landscapes and the magnitude of that. So everybody listening now is like, you would have to think about through how many harvests you would have to go to actually bring that grass out. Like, who's going to plant it? Who's going to cut it? The transport cost of bringing it out. And it's not simply, you cannot burn on site, because if you are burning the plants on site, you are left with all the elements back on the same site. So that does not work. Just wanted to share that.
Right. Thanks a lot, Anja. And I would like to use that to bridge into a related conversation. on restoration, but actually highlighting the impact of demining. And Emily, I mean, the first thing you've heard from Anja. Well, the World Agroforestry Center and related organizations would come in once there is no danger anymore. But in order to demine, you would have to detect the mines. How do you do that? And then secondly, the clearance. There's mechanical clearance, flails, tillers, excavators. They all leave their footprint in the landscape. Help us to understand what's happening during detection and then demining to the landscape.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Michael. So the kind of basic procedure of humanitarian mine action activities would be that the first kind of operational activity is what's called non-technical survey. So that's a non-ground intrusive methodology that aims to identify as accurately as possible where the hazardous area is. So that will be done by lots of community liaison, talking to people who live near about what they've seen, what they experienced during the conflict. It'll be any visual evidence. Sometimes when mines are laid, there might be some signage that's been put close by. There might be physical damage. And increasingly now it's also remote sensing, so drone flights and mapping, possibly the use of different sensors, multispectral or LiDAR in some cases, or even infrared in some very specific cases. So that process aims to really narrow down the area that you're looking at and make it as accurate as possible, which then minimises the amount of clearance and therefore potential damages as well that have to take place. The second stage then would be to decide on the clearance methodology. So I think it's one thing that's important to note there is that ideally it's at that point where we really want to be starting to have conversations with industry experts in different fields, especially environmental protection and restoration, because we can start to inform the work that we do based on those initial conversations, rather than kind of following a set pattern and then enacting remediation or whatever it might be afterwards. So the clearance methodology, it normally is going to be driven predominantly by safety. So what's the threat type, what's the depth of the threat, and then what technologies are available that can deal with that threat type and depth. So it might be metal detection is still very common. So really a person physically searching with a handheld metal detector. It might be a more advanced type of sensor technology. So, for example, ground penetrating radar, where the threat type allows you to identify that. And increasingly, and especially in the context of Ukraine at the moment, it could be mechanical equipment. So mechanical assets range from everything from very small, lightweight, robotic vegetation cutters, right up to kind of 18-ton excavators and front loaders that will go into an area. They'll remove normally the top 30 centimeters or so of soil where the threat type is expected, and they'll place it in another location to be searched either manually or with another machine, and then that soil gets replaced. So in terms of the environmental impacts, the kind of main ones to think about are the removal of vegetation and the disruption of the soil structure. Because especially with mechanical assets, you really are going to be sifting that soil, rotating it, the structure will be broken down, and then you're going to be placing it back again, at which point with no vegetation, it could be vulnerable to wind erosion or flooding. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, that's how we approach that process.
Thank you. Anja, what do you feel about what you're hearing from the ecological perspective?
Well, that's just especially the sort of like destruction of the soil structure and turning around is very much what we have in mines. So I'm not sure. I have a geochemical background, actually. I studied in South Africa, and I've been standing on like black coal minefields in South Africa, which are going in like craters. It's essentially on a moon landscape. Standing on a landscape like that makes you rethink whether nuclear energy is really that bad. I think it's simply because people have no experience in standing on sites like that to see what the destruction is. It's a massive, massive destruction. So it is, I guess it depends, as Elina said, it depends very much on where are you in the landscape, what soil type you have, and the question, I've seen it on the chat as well, the question is, what are you trying to restore towards, what's the end goal? Are we looking at agriculture fields that need to become productive again? For those which are listening in at the moment who are not soil scientists, you only have a top layer of something like, I don't know, it depends on like a really good European soils. We might have like a meter or something of productive soil. But once you turn this around, you lost that. You're left with things which is not longer fertile. It doesn't have nutrients. It's not fertile. It doesn't even produce. It doesn't even have a structure anymore to hold roots. So yes, I think that it's absolutely major. But I'm going to pass back to Elina because she's our soil scientist from Ukraine. I'm pretty sure she deals with that on a daily basis, and it's very much a question of where you are and what you hope the end goal of the restoration is going to be.
So we'll do thank you, Anja and Emily. We'll do a quick response from Elena, and then we'll go to Elizabeth for the questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you everyone for all of your insight. It was very interesting. I did collect a few questions from the chat. There is many, so I try to focus on a few. The first one we have today is, how do restoration processes differ in different world regions? In which aspects do they show unexpected similarity? I will write it in the chat also so you can see it.
Anja, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I can try to. I mean, I think we just kind of like talked about this already. Like if the danger has been removed, which we have just laid out, and like Emily really nicely talked about, like that comes very far afterwards. But if the danger's been removed, we're talking about restoration. Restoration itself it's a very, like the biophysical part is a very standard approach. It works on, you analyze the soil, you look at like what the soil types is, what your position in the landscape is, and then you design the right restoration measures, which is a combination of physical measures where you do something and plants. So, and that's pretty much the same throughout any landscape. However, and I think that maybe be the segue to also what we wanted to talk about, it matters very much. Somebody has to do this. This is not going to happen by itself. We're talking about people. People have to do this physically. So how you actually work with people and have people doing this activity differs very much on where you are culturally, institutionally, and also what people have experienced. And we are talking about a very distressed landscape, distressed people, and that brings about all the difference. There's one thing to have it, but it doesn't mean that it's going to make it a feasible or an attractive solution to the people that need to do so.
Right, thanks a lot, Elizabeth. There was one question in F&A asking whether there are really dogs being used to detect mines and explosives. Emily, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and yeah, the answer will depend really on who you ask on that. So yes, there are dogs being used. As the Halo Trust, we don't use that methodology. It's more common probably as a military technique, but we've run our own internal kind of trials and testing procedures, which has led us to not use it as a methodology. Dogs can be very effective at finding, identifying kind of boundaries of the threat, but they wouldn't necessarily be the appropriate asset, as it were, to use in areas which were densely contaminated, and in particular in the humanitarian sense, when what we're looking for is to identify 100% of the threat and remove it with no margin for error around that. Whereas in the military sense of clearance, the objective might be more seeking access from one area to another, as opposed to kind of large-scale clearance. So yes, they are used, but not currently by ourselves as an organisation.
Thanks. Elizabeth, back to you. Are there other comments you would like to share?
Yes, another area that had a lot of question on was about the involvement of local communities. So there was question on how much are they involved in the restoration process, but also how are they affected? So maybe those two questions could come together. So more about the communities themselves.
Well, a perfect question. Now, Anja, do you want to start about the role of communities, and then we ask Emily and Elina about the specific role of communities in their very special contexts they operate?
Yeah, I can answer this generally from SADC. I don't have the experience in our organization and doesn't have the experience to work in direct conflict zones as Emily and Elina do. But of course, restoration is a physical activity. It's actively people planting and managing soil, managing plants. That just has to happen. So we within our organization, we co-design all our interventions. So that means we actually go out to the community. We sit down. Normally, it's not even me. It's like my colleagues are from the community. They are from the countries, and they do go and spend time and ask, sort of like, and it comes back to the question as well about what you're trying to achieve with restoration. We try to tell everybody who is in the restoration field that it's not really about what you want to do with restoration. It's about what that community wants to do. So it's part of it. It's a conversation, it's a dialogue, and we as technical advisors are essentially just the support to the local community. So the local community is the one doing it. The local community is the one deciding it. We just give our scientific and technical advice to make it happen.
Thanks, Anja. Emily, do you want to build on it before we move to Elina?
Sure, yeah, no, it's a good question. And definitely, I mean, the involvement of the community is absolutely essential to everything that we do. So both in the sense of gathering information, engaging community members who have lived through conflict and possibly subsequent years as well. But it's also part of the kind of model of recruitment, employment that we use. So most of our countries of operation, we depending on the funding situation, we would employ at scale. So Ukraine, for example, we've got around 1,500 staff at the moment. Afghanistan over 1,000, Zimbabwe also over 1,000, and at least kind of 98 to 99% of those people will be locally employed, locally recruited people, which is absolutely key. Both, I mean, there's an economic sense to it as well, in that these are people from those local communities who often have had their means of livelihood removed by conflict or by contamination by landmines. So it's about providing employment opportunities whilst the process takes place of making that area safe, and also in a very practical sense, it's about the knowledge that local people have about their land, about their areas, and about the conflict itself. So there's often again, depending at kind of the stage of the conflict, but particularly in civil conflicts that have come to an end, there would be a strong push to employ people from both sides or multiple different parties, and that, you know, it's got a very strong kind of peace building and reconciliation aspect to it as well. Not necessarily applicable, for example, to interstate conflicts, but certainly if they're civil conflicts, then that's often an employment model that really facilitates the process of bringing people together, as well as providing the information that's needed to actually identify where the threats are.
Can I ask a question? Emily, I have a question for you. When you talked about when we were talking about the dogs and the 100% certainty, do communities ever feel? Is there a point at which communities feel safe to return to their activities in these spaces? I mean, I feel like there's just a long-term trauma that stays with communities. All it takes is one missed unexploded ordinance, and you know, what is when in your experience, when do communities finally, when do you start to see things return to, or do they return?
That's a great question. And yeah, I mean, you're right. It does take a long time to rebuild that trust. In my experience, in the context that I work in, the communities that we work with and alongside, they are often they've often been displaced, like physically displaced from the land that's being cleared, and they've often also lived alongside the threat for a very long time. So it's, there's still a trauma there, there's still a fear, but it's not, these are things that they've experienced on a daily basis, possibly for years of their life. So as soon as that area is declared safe, free from landmines, if I was to use a concrete example, so in Sri Lanka, for example, we've been clearing for many years one of the largest, most complex minefields in the world, in the northern province, and it's a huge area, around 12 square kilometers. And as the clearance takes place, people are literally moving into that area the day after it's been declared safe and the paperwork's been signed, because that desire to get back to their land, to start farming it again, is really strong. So maybe a surprising answer, and is that people really do adapt very quickly, and start using those areas again. And there's many different aspects at play there, but we also tend to do a lot of post-clearance research to ensure that the objectives of the clearance is being fulfilled. So those will include questions to people about subjective questions on feelings of safety. And those are very positive results we get from that, in people's kind of trust in that clearance process.
Thanks, Anja.
Yeah, I just would like to pick up Emily on Craig's question. I think it's also important for everybody who's listening in, especially pretty much everywhere, I would say, the idea that there would be empty land anywhere. So once you're displaced, that you could go to a new area. There is no new area. There's somebody there. It's somebody's land. So the pressure to come back is both wanting to come to your own land, but also not really actually having an option, because where you are, it's temporary, and there is what we would refer to as a hosting community, which in some cases are very supportive, but they are simply just hosting people, and there is that expectation from everybody that this will be, it's a temporal arrangement. People have to go back to their own land. We have that all over Africa, where we have conflicts of internally displaced people because they're ending up on land that's either isn't fertile at all, or they're ending up on land which isn't there, and it results to huge conflicts within the communities. And coming back to the question, what Michael said earlier, that conflict is even amplified in areas where we have less rainfall or more rainfall. Like once the climate plays in and it becomes a much more fragile environment, then there's nothing you can share. It becomes a lot more tense.
Thanks, Anja. Elina, how does that play out in the eastern Ukraine? Before we go back to Elizabeth, if there's any additional question from the audience.
I want to underline the farmers' opinions. So farmers sometimes told us about worries about demining machine. So they told me that demining machine ruined soil structure. So of course of course, we need to discover much more about this situation. And also, farmers are very concerned about their land and sometimes reluctant to let scientists onto it, fearing that if something toxic or polluting is found and becomes public knowledge, so it will be a problem for their farming. Some of them don't agree to include the farmer's name and geographical coordinations in publications. So there are different cases. Of course, we share the results with farms. And of course, when we are talking about communities, so communities are involved in the restoration process, and we organized trainings. For example, last year's 2 years, we organized trainings of experts to assess soil damage due to hostilities. So with Royal Agricultural University together. So we teach people how they can continue to till their soils, how can they investigate the territory, and also public organizations and the military constantly conduct trainings on detecting and handling dangerous objects. Also, tactical medicine training is also conducted for locals.
Thanks, Elina, and that is very much in line with what Emily also outlined. I'm just building on that out of interest. Emily, do you cooperate with the military, or are you entirely civic?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's very important for us to do so. So, in the Ukrainian context, we work very closely with the state emergency services, and we'll support each other as two organizations. So, we'll contact them whenever we find a threat, and sometimes they'll come and destroy it for us if our own teams aren't able to destroy it within a certain time frame. So, yeah, it's always very important for us to have those kind of close links. We remain a humanitarian organization, but working alongside all of the local actors is crucial.
Okay. Anja?
Yeah, I have a question for Emily. So Emily, when normally does your intervention end? When sort of a normal, you were just saying you were talked about, I think you said, was it Zimbabwe? No, you were just talking about landscape. Oh, it was in Sri Lanka where you've been for years. What does years mean? And when does a program, a project end and you go out and you hand over?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, our interventions, because of the speed of
Is it just here? I've lost Emily.
No, Emily cut out
we lost Emily
in your response. Yeah.
Have I?
You're
you're back.
You have to start again.
Right, okay.
We lost you when you said speed.
Right. The speed of mine clearance is inherently a very slow process. So we do tend to be in countries, as long as we have the funding available, we will be there for years, and we will be there until either the threat is completely removed or the capacity is moved over to a local capacity to deal with that threat. So those would be our kind of exit points, as it were. So in Sri Lanka, I mean, we've been in Sri Lanka since the early 2000s. The minefield that I mentioned was we had access to it at the end of the civil war in 2012, and we'll probably have finished clearance of it by next year. So we're really talking about 15 years process to clear that area, which is typical of the enormous scale and the degree of contamination. So yeah, in terms of how our kind of exit, as it were, from a country of operation, that's also a really important question, I think, because it's if we think about Sri Lanka, we hire over 1,000 people. So once that threat is cleared, you're a massive employer in a country that has with people who don't necessarily have the economic opportunities. So it's definitely something we think about when it comes to facilitating training for staff, and kind of very, very slow and with lots of kind of different, I suppose, facilitating staff's exit in a way that allows them to get employment subsequently, rather than kind of the threat is gone, so that's it, we leave, which is very challenging. But I think there's an opportunity there in many contexts to actually start looking at things like restoration activities, sustainable agriculture, because a lot of those people will be going back to land that was previously mined, with very limited employment opportunities, and often with limited resources, because that land might have been laying fallow for the years that it was contaminated, in which time those same people haven't had a source of income. So what we're trying to do, and again, this is really driven by our partnerships with other organisations who have expertise in these areas, is to actually look at post-clearance activities that allow people to get an economic benefit from that land that's been cleared.
And Emily, that's a perfect tee me up to the final question before I close us out here. Anja talked about and Elina talked about the soil degradation that happens when you clear the mines. You talked about, the returning to economic activity on the land after it's clear. What's that time frame like? You finish up, let's say you finish up where you are in Sri Lanka, end of next year. The mines are gone. The soil structure is completely different than it was before, probably quite degraded. How long till that land can start to produce livelihoods for the people who are living there?
Yeah, I mean, this may be a question Anja can answer as well, but from the practical perspective of our projects, so I think it's important just to note that the handover, as we would call it, the handover of cleared safe land to landowners or land users, it's incremental. So yes, we will be working on this minefield until 2026, but land has been in the process of being handed over for the last 15 years. So there are people who are already farming, and they've been farming for years in amongst an area which, their part is safe, but they're surrounded still by active minefield. So we do see very, very quick return to agricultural activity. I mean, it can be a matter of days if people have got the resources to access nursery seedlings or plant their own crops. Then it really would be a matter of days, because they know that this was going to happen. And if they have the resources to access that, then they will start planting pretty much immediately. But then, that doesn't account for everybody. A lot of people just won't have the resources, so they'd then be having to look at getting support to do that, whether that would be through kind of government support or NGOs support.
So with the right resources and depending on the soil type, the soils can be restored, but it's a long-term process. We are at the end of our time, folks. This hour went by really fast. It was a really interesting topic. It's a topic of which I had very little knowledge, and it's a fascinating one. Unfortunately, it's a relevant one, because this is the world. We live in this world where this is a real problem. But I really appreciate your insight and your expertise on this. It's been really, really enlightening, and again, the panelists, we've invited you to stay for the class after, if you have a few minutes. The rest of the attendees, thank you very much for joining us. This has been we appreciate your attention to this, and we'll be having another one in a couple weeks on water, cyclones, and flooding. And then we'll be closing out on food security and food trade later in the month. So keep an eye on LinkedIn and the different places you found out about this. Michael, any closing comments from you?
Thanks to the panel. An enlightening, pertinent, and highly relevant conversation, and it triggered many more questions. And we're going to have another panel soon. Yeah, thanks to everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. The land has been given back